Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica. I don't know if you can see me on the Zoom. I don't want to blind myself with that light, but I'm super psyched to be here giving a presentation in person for the first time since March 2020. Yeah, it's way better than giving to the blank void of Zoom presentations where I can't see anyone's face, and it's really depressing. So I'm here to talk to you today about manta rays. We're going to start off talking about their biology, why they're the coolest animals, and then we're going to talk about my specific research here in Florida. So if you want to click to the next slide, one of the first things I like to talk about when discussing manta rays, because I used to give these manta ray presentations, and I'd give this whole hour-long manta presentation, and people would come up to me afterwards and be like, I fed manta rays in the Grand Cayman Islands. And I'm like, you fed the stingray in the Grand Cayman Islands. So we're going to get this cleared up right at the beginning, as she has already told me. Manta rays and stingrays are different creatures, and they're adapted for very different lifestyles. Stingrays are adapted for a life living on the seafloor. And if you kind of click through, there's little arrows, but they have their eyes on the top of their head so they can see predators from above because they're always on the bottom. Behind their eyes, they have these little kind of holes, which are called sphericals. And if you click to the next one, and the reason why they need sphericals is because their gills are below their body. So their gills are laying in the sand. These sphericals allow them to pump water over their gills. They also, if you keep clicking, have a stinger on a barb that's venomous on their tail. This allows them to protect themselves if a predator tries to attack from above. And they also have a mouth underneath their body that's for feeding in the sand. And if you keep clicking through, the manta ray will pop up. Manta rays are completely different because they're adapted for a life in the open water. So they're never laying on the bottom. They're what's called obligate ram ventilators, which means they have to keep swimming in order to breathe. So they're always swimming through the water column. So what this means is they need to be adapted for a completely different lifestyle than this stingray. So instead of having eyes on top of their head, they have eyes out here on the sides, which allows them to see both up and down. They have a mouth in front, which we'll kind of talk about that in a second. And they have no stinging barb. We actually did a study where we asked fishermen on fishing piers about manta rays, and quite a few of them said, yeah, that's the thing that killed Steve Irwin, right? No, manta rays are harmless creatures. They have no way that they can hurt you. If we go to the next slide, one of the most easily recognizable traits about manta rays is their large size. Manta rays are enormous. They are the biggest rays that are living in the ocean. The largest ones can get 7 to 8 meters in disc width. So disc width means from this tip of the pectoral fin to this tip of the pectoral fin. And that's over 20 feet. It's about 23 to 25 feet the largest ones can get. So that is absolutely enormous. If you look at, this is the founder of the Marine Megafauna Foundation, Andrea Marshall. If you look at the size of her arm, is just like the size of a pelvic fin, which is just insane. These are some of the big ones that are out in Ecuador where I'm dying to go diving. If you go to the next slide. So manta rays are part of a group of animals called elasmobranchs. And what elasmobranchs are all the sharks and rays. And what they have in common is that they have skeletons made out of cartilage. So humans have skeletons made out of bone, but we do have some cartilage, like the end of our nose and the tips of our ears, if you feel them. They're really stretchy and bendy. So being stretchy and bendy is really great in the ocean. It makes them really hydrodynamic. They're really lightweight. But what it doesn't do well, if you click, is preserve. It is very, very rare to see an elasmobranch skeleton like this, or a manta ray skeleton, because they decompose very, very rapidly. But what does preserve well, if you go to your next one, and click again, I think twice more, are manta ray teeth. So manta ray teeth are made of pretty much the same thing that our teeth are made out of, like a dentine-like substance. And they're very, very tiny. So this scale is a millimeter. So they are very, very small. They're not sharp. They're not used for feeding. We'll get to what they're used for later. But these actually fossilize, and based on the fossil record, manta rays as a group are about 5 million years old, which may sound like that's really, really old, but in terms of the evolution of the planet, it's nothing at all. All the elasmobranchs as a group have been around for 400 million years, so manta rays are actually the youngest of all the elasmobranchs. They're the most recently evolved. If you go to the next one, and one of the key characteristics of manta rays are these two fins that come out in front of their face, and those are called cephalic fins. And they use these cephalic fins to funnel water into their mouths. And manta rays, like whale sharks and like the big whales, are filter feeders. So they go, if you go to the next slide, they go through the water with their fins unrolled, and all the water with all the plankton goes in their mouth, and go to the next thing, and gets trapped in these structures in their gills called gill rakers. So basically they act kind of like a sieve. So all the plankton gets stuck in their gill rakers. When they're all nice and full, they close their gills in their mouth and swallow, and that's how manta rays eat. When they're done eating, they can roll up their cephalic fins, and this kind of helps them stow them away to be more hydrodynamic. If you go to the next slide, we have a video of how they roll them up. So we'll just go. Yeah, and we see them do this a lot. It's been hypothesized that they do this to communicate with each other. And when we're in the water with them, you'll see it in some of the other videos, they will kind of like flap one cephalic fin at you, which I'm always wondering, like, what are you trying to tell me? But yeah, so they do unroll and roll them frequently for stuff other than feeding, but we do not fully understand that. So there are two species of manta ray, and I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on how to tell the difference. The co-founder of the Marine Megafauna Foundation, Andrea Marshall, was the first to realize that there were actually two species of manta rays, and this was like 10 years ago. Manta rays haven't really been studied until like the past decade or two. We still know very little about them. But we have two species, the giant manta and the reef manta. Their names kind of describe their habitats and behavior. The giant manta is the large one. It gets really big, up to the 7-8 meters, and they're considered to be a more open ocean species, more like traveling around and living a more roaming lifestyle. The reef manta is slightly smaller, but they still get very big, like 4 to 5 meters. And they're more associated with coastal reef habitats. So I know you might look at these two pictures and think they look very similar. I'm going to teach you quickly how to tell the two apart. So you can look at these white shoulder patches they have. And if you look at the black negative space in between the shoulder patches, the black on the giant manta makes a capital T, and the black on the reef manta kind of makes this curvy Y, or to me, it kind of looks like a mustache. Also, if you look at their ventral sides or their belly, if you keep clicking, the reef manta tends to have spots all over its body, like in between the gills, out in the pectoral fins. The giant manta really only has spots right in the middle. And then just in general, the giant manta has a lot darker shading. It's going to have like a black mouth and really dark shading, and the reef manta is more white. You can keep clicking again. And another feature, there's one more click on this slide, is mantas, the giant manta has a remnant caudal spine, which basically means, you know how stingrays had that stinging barb on their tail to protect them? So there's this little evolutionary remnant. So it's like there is the spine in here, but it's encased like in this calcified mass. So it's not functional anymore. And the reef mantas have completely lost this. So that's another way to tell the difference. Where they're found in the world, this is a global distribution for the giant manta. And basically they're found circumglobally in all the oceans. The giant manta can actually go into quite, they're mostly found in tropics, but they can go up into temperate waters. Like they're found up off New York and New Jersey, off the coast of the United States, can go into quite cold waters actually. And Alfredi is more concentrated in the Indo-Pacific, off the east coast of Africa, where we have some of our study sites over here in Mozambique, and off Australia and Southeast Asia. There's a couple places where you can see their distributions overlap. Usually they'll be found at like separate habitats, but there are a couple places in Indonesia and in Mozambique where you can actually see them like on the same dive sites, which is how our co-founder would see them on the same dive sites and be like, those two are different. One more click. And Andrea has also been working for about 10 years on describing a third species of manta ray, which would be endemic, which means only found in Florida, or I mean the Western Atlantic and Caribbean. So we think all our Florida mantas should be soon described as a new species of manta, which will probably be there, have evolved from Barostris, the giant manta, but are kind of acting a little more like reef mantas is what we currently think. Next one. So if you look at this slide, we have some giant mantas and some reef mantas. Can anyone tell me which manta this is? Down in the bottom left for you guys on Zoom. That's a giant manta. What about this one on the top left? Giant. This one? Reef. Yeah, you guys got it. That's awesome. Yeah. So basically the small T are all reef mantas, and then the corners are all giant mantas. And what's very handy about manta rays is they have all these crazy spots on their belly, and they're unique to each individual. So they're just like a fingerprint. So it's really handy for us as researchers, because all we need to do is take a picture of their belly and we can know which individual manta it is. I grew up as a biologist studying sea turtles, and we had to put tags in their flippers to do this. So it's really great to just be able to go up, snap a photo, and collect that kind of data. I press play the video. So one of my favorite things about manta rays, this is a female manta named Luna, is that they will exhibit curious behavior, which this is what they'll do. Sometimes they'll upside down swim underneath you to get a better look at you. And this is what happened on my very first encounter with the manta ray, and I absolutely fell in love. But this is not like usual behavior, what you would see with a fish. You don't really associate this with fish species. And what we think is that manta rays are very smart. A lot of people have that impression after being in the water with them. If you go to the next slide, click again. One more. Manta rays have really big brains. They have the biggest brain out of any fish, and they have the biggest brain relative to their body size. So this means they don't just have a big brain because they're a really big animal. They have a larger brain than we would expect for them being so big. So why do they have this really big brain? You know, animals don't have these things that they put a lot of energy into unless they're using them for something. So if you look at a similar species ecologically, to the next slide, is their cousin, the whale shark. They're both filter feeders. But the whale shark, even though it's 10 times bigger than a manta ray, has a brain that's a third of the size. So it probably doesn't have anything to do with looking for plankton out in the open ocean. What we think they have this big brain for, if you go to the next slide and click play, this might be loud. Okay, there's no sound, that's good. Is because they're very social creatures. This video, unfortunately, is not mine. This is at a place in the Maldives where hundreds of mantas will get together to feed. And mantas will actually feed cooperatively, working together as a group. They have a lot of different feeding strategies where they can maximize their intake of plankton. And this one, which is called Cyclone Feeding, they basically will do this only in really dense patches of plankton, and they'll basically make like a tornado that creates a vortex of plankton. So we think they're using these big brains to work together in order to maximize their survival. That's another organization does research there, so I don't really want to step on their territory. This is the Manta Trust does research in the Maldives. They've been doing it there for 15 years or something like that. But yeah, I would love to go there. You need to go there during a very certain, like, I think it's monsoon season to see this aggregation. And if you click to the next one, this is a video that I took with my drone out in Boynton Beach, Florida, of 2 manta rays that were feeding together. So it's not always quite as dramatic as hundreds of mantas feeding together, but like watching these 2 individuals swim, and watch this, they like time this turn like perfectly together. It's just really cool. On to the next one. So another way manta rays are social is when they mate. So first we're going to go over the difference between male and female manta ray, and then we're going to talk about their mating behavior. So if you go to the next one, so how we tell the difference between a male and a female manta ray is by looking at their pelvic fins. This one here on the left is a female. You just see pelvic fins. With the males, you're going to see these paired structures called claspers. These are the copulatory organs of elasmobranchs. So in all sharks and rays, you're going to see claspers on the males. And what's handy about the claspers is they grow as the male ages. So by looking at the relative size of these claspers, we can tell basically how old the manta is. So if you look at the manta in picture A, that is a juvenile manta ray. The claspers do not extend past the pelvic fins. They're very, very tiny. In B and C is a subadult male. They've started to grow, but they're not fully matured. And in picture D is a fully sexually mature male. They're fully calcified. They come down fully past the pelvic fins, and you'll also see these swollen clasper glands above the claspers. So when manta rays get together to mate, if you want to just go to the next video, this is actually a video from the Manta Trust. They get together, just for reference, this is the female. They get together and form what are called mating trains, which is typically one female followed by many males, sometimes just one, sometimes up to 20. And the female will perform evasive behavior. She'll do loop-de-loops, and the males basically just follow her around. And this can go on for hours upon hours upon hours. We don't really know how the final male is selected. That would be a great study for someone to look at. But so they'll do this mating train a lot, and sometimes the male will even attempt to mate with her, and the female will kind of like buck him off and be like, no. So she has to be ready. And if you go to the next one, this is the beginning of mating in mantas, and most ray species do this pretty similarly. So the male is on top and the female is on the bottom in this top picture. So what the male will do is come on top of the female and kind of start to slide out to her pectoral fin. And what he's trying to do is to grab onto her pectoral fin with his mouth. And that comes into where they probably still have these teeth, because they're not using teeth to chew the plankton up. But these teeth probably help them grab on to the female so they can get traction for mating. So he'll put like a really good chunk of that fin in his mouth and use that to flip himself over. If you go to the next slide. And then they'll mate belly to belly. And manta rays are negatively buoyant, which means if they stop swimming, then they sink. So once the mating starts, it lasts literally like 20 seconds maybe. because they start sinking to the bottom and it's over all very quickly. And I have some new footage for this presentation. If you go to the next slide. Oh, well, that's fine. I forgot this was here. You can also tell if the females have recently mated by they'll have these mating scars on their pectoral fins. So that's a way we can tell if the females are sexually mature or not. But if you go to the next video, I actually was able to film some eagle rays mating. And it's the same type of behavior. You see the male grabs onto the pectoral fin of the female, and then he kind of spends a little while arranging himself. They only insert one of the claspers. And you can tell when they start to mate because they will start to sink. And they sink, hit the bottom, and show's over. Yeah, so that's how ray mating happens. I was so excited to see that. I was just happened to be filming these eagle rays, and that happened so quick. And to the next one. That was up in Jupiter, Florida. Mm-hmm. So then the female will be pregnant. They'll be very visibly pregnant, as you see here. Manta rays are pregnant for 12 months. So they're pregnant for even longer than humans are. And if you go to the next one, they'll just click twice on this one. They'll produce one pup. Sometimes they can have two, but in general, they have one. And they'll take 2 to 5 years off from each year from pregnancy. So the moral of this story is that they have a very, very, very conservative reproductive strategy. They produce very, very few babies over their lifetime. And this is what the fetus looks like inside the womb. They can't really fit. They're too big to fit in there with their pectoral fins out. So they're folded up like little manta burritos, which is adorable. And then they come out ready to go on their own. There's no parental care in manta rays. The mom has done enough. But they're born at about 6 feet across. No one has ever seen a manta be born in the wild. It has only been observed at one aquarium in Japan, where they've had about, I think they've had 8 manta births now. And I think their largest one was 1.8 meters across. So that's 6 feet. That's a smaller species. So they come out very large and ready to roam the oceans. So the conservation status of manta rays, like I told you before, that it wasn't until very recently that people really started to study manta rays in depth. If you do one more click. The co-founder of MMF was assigned by the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which does global assessment on every kind of taxa, plants, fish, giraffes. She was assigned in Africa to go assess the conservation status of manta rays back in 2003. And what she had to come back with was basically like, we can't. We don't know enough about them to even say what's happening. So click again. In 2011, we finally had enough data to begin assessing their populations, and they were assigned the status of vulnerable, which means they're considered to be facing a high risk of extinction in the wild. Unfortunately, if you click one more time, the giant manta ray last year was uplisted to endangered. So they're facing an even higher risk of extinction in the wild. So why are they having these problems? There are lots of threats to manta rays. They can become entangled in mooring lines or fishing nets. These cephalic fins are just perfect for getting entangled in nets. And remember, I told you that they have to keep swimming in order to breathe. So if anything stops them from swimming, they're going to drown. They can also be hit by vessels. Both of these photos were taken in Florida, where we see quite a few vessel strike injuries. These are kind of the general threats that are facing almost everything in our oceans. Coastal development, which is causing habitat loss. Climate change can affect their food availability. If the ocean acidifies, all the little plankton that they eat can lose their shells. Pollution's a pretty big one in Florida. We're hoping to start some research on that, but we see mantas swimming in these outflow waters that are, we know, filled with lots of agricultural pollutants and things. So we honestly have very little idea of how that actually affects these animals. Another threat to particularly manta rays, since they filter feed, are microplastics. So these are plastics that have broken down into these teeny tiny pieces and are basically the same size as the plankton that they eat. One of our researchers did a study in Indonesia and found that manta rays were consuming over 60 pieces of plastic per hour. So this can be very problematic, and we really don't know what overall effect it has on them, but plastics can leach toxins, and it also could affect the uptake of nutrients in their digestive system. But by and far, the biggest threat to manta rays are fisheries. They're both caught in targeted fisheries and as bycatch. So they can be caught as bycatch, especially in gill nets, but in long lines and other types of fisheries. This fishery, this picture in the background here, was from a market in Indonesia. This market doesn't exist anymore because they're now protected in Indonesian waters. But the reason there's a targeted fishery for them, they are used as food in some places, but what is really driving that high demand is some of these traditional Asian medicines, which became popular like 10 to 20 years ago. And what they're interested in are those gill rakers. So what's filtering the plankton out of the water, they basically dry them up and sell them as a health tonic that's basically considered to be like a cure-all for everything. The logic, I'm putting logic in quotation marks, being that since these things are filtering food out of the water, that they will filter the toxins out of your body. There's no science behind that, but this is what's driving a lot of the targeted fisheries because they can get a lot of money for these gill rakers. The next, I'll go back again. So what's important to remember is what I said about their conservative life history strategies. You know, the females are producing one young, say, every 2 to 5 years. So they cannot replace themselves very much. So they can withstand very little to practically no fishing pressure. Yeah.
I used to take fish oil because I thought it was good for my joints and marketing and all that stuff. Right. And then in a presentation on whale sharks, someone talked about how in certain places they'll take whale sharks and convert them into fish oil. And it's really hard to tell where the fish oil is coming from. Regulations, do they do that with manta rays as well?
To the oil?
To extract fish oil from them.
Not that I know of. I haven't heard that being a problem, but they might use every bit that they can. Cool. So now I'm going to go away from sad manta topics to talk about what I do here in Florida. That's a picture of me more than a decade ago. I moved to Florida after I graduated college to study sea turtles, and studying sea turtles on Florida beaches involves driving up and down on this ATV every day and counting turtle tracks. I've counted thousands and thousands of turtle tracks in my lifetime. But what would happen is when I was driving up and down the beach, I would see these huge rays swimming by in like less than 5 feet of water. And I was a scientist, I was a scuba diver, and I had no idea that there were mantas in Florida. So being a good scientist, if you go to the next slide and go one more click, back. I went to Google Scholar, which is the Google for nerds, and typed in Manta Ray, Florida. And this was the old result. We now have some of our research that comes up, but the old result says, this was the only paper about manta rays in Florida published in 1998. And basically it just says they found 3 mantas in the Indian River Lagoon in the 1990s. So there was very little knowledge about them. And sometimes I tell this in a presentation, it sounds like I went to seeing manta rays to starting my own project. There's actually like 6 years between me going to grad school and studying sea turtles, getting a job on a sailboat, moving back to Florida. Then, I think if you go to the next slide, nope, not that one, never mind. Then I decided to start the Florida Manta Project. I forgot about this slide, but we can go to it. The only other research I could find about manta rays is from the turn of the century, so the beginning of the 1900s, where you can find some really old articles, but they're actually really cool, about people hunting manta rays, mostly spearing them. Does anyone know who this guy is? Yes, Teddy Roosevelt, our former president with 2 mantas. This is on the Gulf Coast of Florida. So there's some cool stories about, well, they would basically spear them and have to chase them down for hours and hours. But there are also stories of people like anchoring their boat offshore and waking up in the middle of the night to their boat being towed because the manta's cephalic fins would get caught in their anchor chain and they'd find themselves just being towed out to sea. And this is before they had outboard motors. So sometimes they would throw a second anchor down to protect them from manta rays, which I think is kind of funny. But yeah, they used to call them devilfish and they were very, very scared of them. We can go to the next one. Now I decided to start the Florida Manta Project. And, you know, back when I started this, I really started going out on my days off from my sea turtle job because I wasn't even sure if there were enough mantas in Florida to study. I mean, a lot of people told me that like it wasn't a good idea, that they were too rare, that they only came by every now and then. So we found out that there were enough. And what we do, if you go to the next slide, when we go out on a manta survey, this is actually how we used to do it. In the first 3 to 4 years, I used to just stand on the bow of the boat and look for dark shapes swimming around. I like to joke that I've identified every manta-shaped rock in Palm Beach and Martin County. And literally, I do know individual rocks. But now, if you click, we use drones almost exclusively, and I am absolutely obsessed. Like that eagle ray mating behavior, I probably never would have seen without a drone. We see so much cool stuff with them. So now we mostly use the drone, and this is what we're looking for. A fun way to tell a manta from a rock is it's moving, and look for these whites of the cephalic fins is always the key to being like, that one's a manta. If you go to the next slide. So when we find a manta, we get in the water with it. And we're doing all of this free diving. This happens very shallow. They move very fast. Scuba equipment would just not be possible. So the data we're trying to collect is we try to get underwater photo of the spot pattern so we can tell which individual it is. We also, while we're getting that ventral photo, we get a picture of the pelvic fin so we can determine what sex the manta is. We collect data on habitat. Are they swimming over the reef or over the sand? Any anthropogenic impacts, which just means any impacts by humans or any injuries that we see, like this manta has a fishing lure in her mouth. And then also behavior, are they feeding or are they traveling? Environmental conditions and any associated species that might be swimming with them. You can keep going. So just really quick, I was telling her, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, earlier about what I put these pictures in my presentation, and I have a lot of friends who are professional underwater photographers that make what I do look really, really cool. But this is not what it always looks like. If you go to the next slide, this is frequently what it looks like. You know, if they're feeding, usually there's plankton in the water and that water can be really murky. So it's not always that beautiful. I just like to make that abundantly clear because people think it's way too easy, and it's not at all. So now for the results of our project, we can actually change this from this week to 117 individuals. But yeah, we have well over 100 individuals we've identified in the South Florida area, and we have over 300 manta encounters. And the reason we have more encounters than individuals is because we're seeing the same individuals over and over. Yeah, so we know a lot of these individuals. All the pictures on the bottom we're taking at different dates than the ones on the top. So we match them by their spot patterns. And a lot of these mantas I get to know, and we saw 4 mantas on Monday, and we knew who they all were without having to go home and look at the computer. I mean, we always double check just to make sure, but like we get to know some of these mantas quite well. Gilly, who's in the middle, is the manta that we've seen the most. We saw him for the last time in 2020, which was his 4th year. So I don't think we're going to see him again. It's funny. One of my friends named him after the guy she was dating at the time, and they ended up breaking up. And then he became our most cited manta ray, and he's literally on stickers and posters in this presentation. So be careful who you name animals after. But yeah, we can go to the next slide. And one of our big findings, if you click one more time, is that all the males we see, click one more, are sexually immature. So on the males, we're only seeing these very teeny tiny claspers. So all the males we're seeing are juveniles. It's likely that all the females we're seeing are juveniles too, based on their estimated disc width and the fact that we don't see any mating scars and we haven't seen any pregnancies. So basically we're seeing exclusively juveniles here in South Florida. And the other thing, another big finding of our studies is that we're seeing a lot of human manta interactions. There's a lot of people in South Florida. There's a lot of people on the water, and they're definitely interacting with these mantas and not always in a positive way. If you go to the next one, we see about 1/4 of our mantas with fishing line entanglement. It's either fishing line entanglement or fishing hooks. You can see this manta has 2 hooks, and she actually had another one on this side this day. And then we can see a lot of variation in the severity of these line entanglements. This one that's up in the top corner, it's hard to see because this picture is a monofilament. It's a really hard thing to take a picture of, but this monofilament was actually, I pulled it out and it was all in through his gills. So I think maybe he had like swallowed it or something. This manta has been through a lot. I've never seen this one again, but had it wrapped around her face. And you see where it's cutting in here. If we see these triangular notches, are usually indicative of fishing line injuries, because they'll have this long piece of trailing line and they'll do this feeding behavior where they make these big loop-de-loops, and that line gets wrapped around their bodies and it can get really tight and cut into them. And a lot of anglers tell me, fishing hooks will rust out. They won't be in there that long. And it depends what your fishing hook is made out of, which one of our studies found out that most people don't know what their fishing hooks are made out of. But you can see by like the algal growth on this line that it hasn't just been in there for a short time. And then it can also get wrapped around their cephalic fins. This is a female manta. This picture was from 2019. We saw her again in 2020 and that cephalic fin was completely gone. So that happens with some frequency around the world, and that probably has an effect on their ability to feed. Oh, sorry, warning, this photo is gross if you don't want to see it. Here's Gilly again. We saw him with a very fresh injury from a boat propeller. And how you tell it's a boat propeller is you look for these parallel lines right here, which are the spinning propeller, and then this injury is from what's called the skeg or the keel of the outboard motor. But what's cool about Manta Ray, so this date is August 15th, 2018. And if you go to the next slide, we saw him 4 days later, and that's what it looked like. So they can heal really, really fast. Yeah, we saw him again after this, and it's just like, you can barely see the scar. So while it's great that they can heal really fast, what it also means is we're probably underestimating the amount of injuries, because when they heal and they're these light gray scars, it's really hard to see on a quick encounter. So I feel like the injuries we're documenting are probably a minimum of what's actually going on. This is another manta named Rosa. You can actually see through her pectoral fin where she got hit by a boat, but that was July 2nd. And if you go to the next slide, she was pretty much all healed up within 6 weeks. And we've seen her again too, and you can barely see, like, these notches have closed up quite a bit. So it's really cool to document these healing rates, and you're wondering maybe how they get hit by boats. If you click play on this, they feed at the surface a lot. We also see, which is a unique behavior here to Florida, is manta rays hanging out in these man-made inlets. And why I think they're hanging out in these inlets, oh, I hate watching these videos, is because remember I said they're obligate ram ventilators. They need to keep swimming in order to breathe. And what we see them do is go into these inlets, which have very strong currents, and just kind of face into the current. So we think they're going in there and just using it and letting the water flow over their gills and taking a break. But we will watch them in here. They will spend hours in these inlets with boats going over them. And it is horrifying to watch, but you see the mantas don't really react that much to it. So I don't know, it's something I really want to study a lot further. Yeah, I haven't seen any like actually get injured when this happens. Sometimes I sit on the seawall and yell at boats and tell them, like, there's a manta there, and they stop and look. But yeah, that's my boyfriend on a paddleboard there going to get an ID shot of that manta. That's Boynton Beach. So what all of this means, the fact that we're seeing exclusively juveniles and that we're seeing the same individuals over and over in the same habitat, is that South Florida likely is a nursery ground for manta rays, which is really cool because there are very few nursery grounds that have been identified for manta rays around the world. So we have a very special place for the little large baby manta rays, but you know, they're right next to all these big urban habitats. So they're these baby manta rays, when they're most vulnerable, experiencing a lot of pressure, human pressures. We have a lot of other new research going on, which I don't have time to talk about, but if anyone wants to know about it, I will tell you. We've started some telemetry projects using satellite tags and acoustic tags. This here is a satellite track for one of the mantas we have tagged in 2019. We tagged it kind of in the Jupiter area and went all the way up to Daytona and then all the way down to Miami, and then came back here and hung out in Jupiter for a couple weeks. This happened in, I think, 70 days was the total time this manta was tagged. So these mantas are moving quite large distances, but probably showing site fidelity to some of like our areas that we see down here in South Florida, which is really cool. We also do aerial surveys in a small Cessna plane, which allows us to go a lot farther than we do in a boat. This year, we actually just started a project in Central Florida up near Cape Canaveral, where they see lots and lots of mantas. I'm talking hundreds of mantas, but they're mostly adult manta rays. And there's a whole cobia fishery that's centered around these manta rays. If you want to look at it, go on YouTube and Google cobia Florida manta ray. There's tons of videos, and they basically go out and look for manta rays and cast at them to catch the cobia underneath them. So we're working with some anglers to learn more about ways to minimize or come up with the best practices way. And we have a whole paper published with anglers here in South Florida about their knowledge of and interactions with mantas. Yep, and if anyone's interested, anyone has kids, nieces, friends with kids, we have an education program where we'll come to schools and give talks, and we have lesson plans for elementary students, and we're working on ones right now for middle school students. Yep, and this is where you can find us on social media. I'm at Florida Manta Girl. You can also find Marine Megafauna Foundation, and we have a pretty new website. So if you go to the marinemegafauna.org/Florida Manta Project, it looks really pretty and has a lot about what we're doing in some of those new projects. So thank you to everyone who gives us money. And I think next one, yeah, volunteers. And then thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun to give a talk in person. And I stayed pretty still, didn't I?
You did great.
So thank you. These are just manta videos at the end. These are 7 mantas I found feeding together. This is sped up. It's like a 10-minute video that I sped up. I think a dolphin swung through at one point. Yeah. Cool. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, there goes a dolphin. Yeah.
So do you guys assume that you won't see Gilly again because he's maturing and so likely move on from South Florida?
Yeah, so in 2017, 2018, and 2019, we saw him a lot. 2020, he just came by once. So we know he's a minimum of 4 years old. Males, we think they mature earlier than females, so they could mature maybe around 5 or 6. So we're thinking he probably has another habitat that he's going to, would be my hypothesis currently. We don't know for sure, but I think a project in Australia has identified one individual for almost 40 years.
Wow.
So, you know, on the decades, probably 40 to 50 years.
What are some of the strategies for conservation, considering that they have such a slow reproduction rate and they migrate around globally?
Yeah, no, it's really tough. And they're protected under a lot of international treaties. They're protected under CITES, which is the Trade and Endangered Species. I just lost the C and the I. They're protected under CITES. They're protected under the UN's Migratory Species Program. So, you know, a lot of countries are supposed to be enforcing these things, and to some extent that happens, but you know, it can be tough, especially like in years when like the pandemic happens and, you know, no one's out there to see what's going on. So, yeah, but better fisheries practices and just making sure no illegal exportation is going on.
I have a few questions from our Zoom viewers.
Yep.
If that's okay. Sasha asked, so the species you're seeing here in Florida is Virostris?
Yes, technically right now there's still Virostris, the giant manta, but we think there's genetic and taxonomic evidence that they're genetically distinct from Virostris.
Bridget asked, is the spotted eagle ray like a cousin of the manta ray? She
Yeah.
sees them regularly feeding at the boat docks. They seem to eat the mussels that are attached to the docks.
Yeah, it's really common to see eagle rays around marinas. I love eagle rays. I think they're so cute. Yeah, and they are a relative of the manta ray.
Jill asked, are there opportunities for volunteers?
Yes, go look at our Florida Manta Project website, and there's information there.
And I'll send the link to everybody who joined tonight. So if anybody's interested, I'll include those links there. Jenny asked, are there theories as to why the cobia swim under the mantas?
Yeah, so cobia will associate with any large animal. They see them with leatherback sea turtles, with bull sharks, which a lot of the fishermen complain because fishing cobia off bull sharks is really hard because you have to get them to the boat before the bull shark gets to them. So yeah, but a lot of them, we started doing these interviews to talk to them about manta rays, and what I'm learning is that their cobia fishery is like, they can't find cobia like they used to. So it's very interesting.
Do we know anything about the development of their senses? Like, do they have a good sense of hearing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would make a great doctoral study. There has been some stuff done on their vision, which they have pretty good vision. They don't see as well. Why they flip over and look upside down at us is because they don't see as well dorsally or like right behind them. But yeah, as far as the other senses, I know some people who are starting some work on those, but it's hard to do those on wild sensory studies on wild animals. And yeah, there's very few captive mantas.
Oh, you guys go ahead.
You go first.
She had a question about,
Yeah.
Do they have a good sense of seeing? Do they use it to hunt it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would assume that they're probably using their sense of smell to find their food. Plankton can release, I'm trying to remember what the compound is called right now. It's not in my head, but yeah, they will cause some odors and stuff that they might be smelling, or they might actually be tasting the water. But yeah, we don't really know that much about how they find their food sources.
What about their longest migration, and do you put satellite tags on the region tagging? Satellite tracking tags.
Longest migration, I mean, they can migrate thousands of kilometers.
They can go across the ocean. They can go to sublining, uplining.
Yeah, they haven't tracked any crossing an ocean. Some of the ones they put on Mozambique have gone into South Africa. They've crossed pretty long distance. One in Australia went 1,000 kilometers, a Reef Manta Ray. So they're capable of very long distance migrations. Do they do it that frequently? Maybe not. And yeah, we have put satellite tags on. COVID kind of broke up that project for a little bit, but we started putting more on this summer. So that's going to be really important for trying to figure out, since they're an endangered species in the US, what their critical habitat is. Because basically they were listed on the Endangered Species Act, and we don't really know anything about them here in Florida to protect them.
Has there been any connectivity here in Mexico, for example?
No, we have a global online database called Manta Matcher. So we have people in Mexico upload them. Also, there's a population in the Gulf of Mexico off Texas. Yeah, I always tell my intern, if you see a match on there, call me in the middle of the night. But no, I think probably that the ones on our East Coast, probably the adults are spending most of their time, I think, going up the coast. Because people do see them going all the way up. It's just so much harder to study them because the water gets so terrible. But possibly some of the satellite tags they put on down in the Yucatan, they've started heading towards like the Gulf of Mexico. So they haven't stayed on long. It's really hard to get the satellite tags to stay on. There's no really great place to attach them to these flat pancakes, and they breach and sharks bite them. So yeah, it's tough.
Is there, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if you see one with a hook or a line, is it possible to remove it, or you can't?
Yeah, actually, I used to have that video in this presentation. But yeah, I mean, we were doing that 2 days ago, taking fishing line off. So anytime we can, sometimes the mantas are really cooperative and let us take it off. Sometimes they want nothing to do with us, but we can try to get one snip in and at least try to like reduce the damage as much as possible.
Is there a specific season or time frame when they mate or have their offspring?
Yeah, so we're not seeing mating behavior here because it's all juveniles, but other populations do see certain times of the year where there is more mating behavior and maybe when new ones show up, but that differs between the different populations.
Do you hypothesize that the Florida giant manta may be a subspecies or a new species?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am personally not a taxonomist in all of these questions. We think it's a new species, and my colleague is currently writing that paper. So yeah, stay tuned to all our social medias because we will be announcing that when it happens. But there's also been other papers. There's like 3 or 4 other genetic papers that have been out that show that this population is genetically distinct from the other populations.
What's the size range of the juveniles you see in Southeast Florida? Any idea what age range they would be?
Yeah, determining the age is really difficult. We do see really small ones where you can still see like a little umbilical scar, which means they're probably very, very young. But the size range in feet is usually between 6 and 10 is pretty standard. I would say like an 8 foot is kind of like our standard manta size.
So we don't know where they go when they mature.
No, I mean, so there's a seasonal population that we've started to study in Central Florida that's made up of mostly adults, and I did observe courtship behavior there. So those could be the ones that are mating and producing this juvenile population. We're hopefully be doing a genetic study. It's just getting enough genetic samples is the hard part, to see if those two populations are connected.
How do you get the genetic sample?
You put a little biopsy punch on the end of a pole spear and kind of like a little Hawaiian sling and they have not a picture, but they have like a little kind of muscly area right by their dorsal fin that you can get like a little tissue sample from.
Can stingray be like this big?
Some stingray species can get quite large, yes.
And like, so if it's on the bottom and kind of flipping and like it was nesting, it's a stingray.
That's absolutely a stingray. Yep.
Even very big.
Yep.
The rough stingrays are huge.
Yeah, those can get really big.
So is there somewhere in the Caribbean, the Americas, where there's an aggregation of adults that people know of? And second part of that question is, all the ones off of there is reef mantas, or are they all juveniles? They're all kind of.
No, they get adult mantas there, and that's really the only place where there's an aggregation. There's some that kind of aggregate in Brazil, but through the rest of the Caribbean, it's very like hit or miss. They pop up every now and then, but someone is starting a project on Caribbean mantas, but I'm always like, I don't know how you're going to find them reliably, because I used to live in the Caribbean for 2 years sailing around, and I never saw one, and I was looking really hard. But yeah, in Mexico, they have adult mantas off the Isla Mujeres.
I have just a couple more questions. Are there any other Manta Rays, Devil Rays found here in coastal waters?
Good question. Yes, we actually have 3 species. We have Mobula hypostoma, which is called with these common names, the Atlantic Devil Ray. So these ones are really small. You'll see them more on the Gulf Coast than the Atlantic Coast. So we do see them sometimes, but they can get into very large schools. I'm actually writing a paper on the Chilean Devil Ray. It's a worldwide distributed ray, but we don't have like a confirmed range for the Western Atlantic. So I was supposed to write that paper, but then Manta season got started. So that's actually on my to-do list for tomorrow. And then I probably wouldn't have said this for Florida, but literally this week, a diver off of Jupiter saw what's called a spine-tail devil ray, Mobula mobular, which I'm going to send to some other researchers who are going to write another paper similar. He was like, here's another Chilean devil ray. And I was like, nope, that one's different. So that's very cool. So those are the only 3 other species of mobulas that we would get here.
Don asked, I hope to do a touristy manta ray dive in Hawaii. Is tourism diving a concern for their well-being?
Yeah, it can be. And, it depends how well regulated it is. I mean, they can get hit by boats is the main concern, which has happened in Hawaii, and they have adjusted their tourism practices because mantas were getting hit by boats. So I think just make sure you go out with a reputable dive operator.
And last question, do you take DNA samples of the known manta rays to determine relationships?
Yes, that is what we want to do, but to do what's called this kinship analysis, where you can literally tell like who's related to who, you need a lot of samples, and I'm learning a lot by talking to geneticists, and that's something we very much want to do, but it's getting the number of samples is the hard part. Yeah, anyone can email me with other questions too. I'm happy to talk about manta rays on and on.